Hey, my beautiful souls! Welcome to the Spatial Sarah podcast. I am on a mission to bring back the lost art of meaningful conversations that touches our heart and expand our perspectives. My intention is to create a space where you feel seen, heard, and loved. Each episode is crafted to hold that space, allowing you to open up and explore thoughts and ideas in a safe environment. So, grab your imaginary marshmallows, find a cozy spot under the sky full of stars, and join me in these campfire-worthy conversations as I take you on a journey to places you've never been and spark conversations you've never had before. Let's go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Spatial Sarah podcast. I have Kerry Howard with me. She's a quantum psychologist and a mental health coach. Hi, Kerry. Welcome. And I'm so glad that you're here today.
Thanks, Sarah, for inviting me on.
I'm glad that you're here today to have this conversation. So I'd like to start off with this question that I usually ask. What brings you joy, Kerry?
I think what brings me joy is being authentic and being able to then, show up each day feeling like you're living an authentic life. And sometimes that means embracing the challenges that come our way so that we can improve and move forward. And but I think really being true to yourself, that's probably the thing that invigorates me the most.
I think that's one of the big things that is missing in this world is us being ourselves, just our authentic self. I think the world needs more of people who are just being themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a big part of that is being able to model that in terms of, the challenges that come our way, but being able to, even in my space, talk about the challenges that I also experience in my life, because just because I've got a psychologist sort of background doesn't mean that I don't also experience challenges in my own mental health, right? And that's one of the things that I think is really important to talk about, and that is being authentic.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. Yeah. Do you want to share with us what is quantum psychology and what do you do as a quantum psychologist?
So it's interesting because this is a term that's only been recently applied to me, actually. Some other people ended up calling me this because when we start talking about, I talk a lot about quantum physics and the experience that we have in our, I would say our 5-dimensional world is the easiest way I talk about it, and our level of consciousness of what's going on in our 3D world, and being able to bridge that gap between the two. For a lot of people, I really believe that in the 3D world, a lot of people who experience mental health issues may be seeing things that are actually in an alternative dimension, and they just don't have any 3-dimensional way of explaining it because it doesn't actually fit into our 3D world. So, and that's when it was actually somebody else who called me the quantum psychologist, because I was talking about these concepts. And, I'm not the first person to talk about quantum psychology. There was some very interesting professors from the US and other places in Europe, sort of, I want to say since the late 80s, that have kind of danced around this idea of quantum psychology. But when we understand ourselves, and traditional psychology's perspective is really based on, very strong and rigid rules in a 3-dimensional world. And I think that a lot of mental health actually completely comes to us from our alternative kind of consciousness. And when we can understand that and tap into it and even get some knowledge about it, I think it actually can reduce our expression of what is commonly called, mental health disorders or difficulties in this kind of experience and this consciousness. So that's the real bridging element, is probably that part of it. And then rather than looking at everything as being a disorder, it really then just looks at it's not a disorder, it's just a different way of viewing the world. And quantum physics actually allows us to understand that that's possible. Different levels of consciousness exist for people to be able to tap into those different planes. And then that limit, we don't have to, be sitting in judgment with it with a three-dimensional experience and putting it into that three-dimensional kind of framework for us to judge, because it doesn't belong there, right?
Right. You mentioned about the 5-dimensional. What's that actually? What were you referring to?
So a lot of people who might have experienced some level of awakening or astral projection or some other forms of, I want to say, alternate reality experiences, even some of the basics like some cacao ceremonies, it actually allows our frequency levels to tap into different things. If anybody might have heard of Reiki healing or that sort of thing, we're actually operating in that sort of radio frequency level. It's a different frequency. We don't see it, but we know that it exists. So and we can measure it. And so it's the same thing when we start talking about our 5-dimensional sort of existence. There are other layers to our experience that, when we practice, and we do need to practice, but we can tap into it. Anybody who does, yoga or any sort of form of physical kind of connection where they're really trying to tap into what their body's feeling, often will tap into another level of consciousness or tapping. We'll often talk about tapping into source. It's that energy expression. And quantum physics actually says that all energy exists, and it is in a continuous kind of flow. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so we do have ways of tapping into alternative perceptions, and that's what gives us the extra dimensions to, what we see in our 3-dimensional world, and, tapping into those alternate levels of consciousness. And I think when we start to do that, we get much more accepting and open about different people's perceptions of reality. And it's a really important point, because a lot of what happens in our 3-dimensional world is we sit in judgment about other people's perceptions of reality because we don't experience them, therefore they don't exist. And it's not true. It's just that you don't experience them, therefore you haven't opened up your level of consciousness in your world. It doesn't mean that it hasn't opened up for others. And so I think that's the thing where I start talking about our mental health in general. I honestly believe that, people who have had more emotional fluctuations are more in touch with the opportunity to be in touch with other dimensions more easily, I think. But we don't give them a sense of explanation or understanding about that. We don't give people a lot of education about it. But when we do spend time, like, most people, when they meditate, then their mental health improves. When we start doing things like yoga and we get in touch with our body, our mental health improves. So when we start kind of tapping into those alternate sort of expressions or spheres of consciousness, then our mental health improves. And so it's not actually hard to understand that what we want to try and do is spend more time, tapping into those experiences, and also tapping into things that make our body, our physical body, actually feel better. So, when we meditate, when we, spend time doing yoga, when we're dancing and we're actually sitting in certain vibrational levels, you feel better. When we spend time in the sun and, our body is recharging because we're like little solar batteries, we feel better. And I think it's the ability to be able to talk about all of those things, not just as some sort of ideal, just do this, because we still approach it in a very 3D world. But when we understand that what we're doing to our own energy levels when we experience those things, then we have a much better understanding of potential. What's the potential in our 5D existence? And that's a big part of where we start talking about things like manifesting and, bringing these things into our realm of being. It's about how do we kind of open up ourselves to alternative kind of consciousness elements. And, almost we talk about it like an element of faith or belief in what it is that you're manifesting for yourself. And you are then energetically drawing it to you. And from a quantum physics perspective, there's science to that. It's not just this ethereal, airy-fairy kind of thing. Yeah, you go and manifest, right?
A lot of people think that. A lot of people
They
think
do.
the woo-woo thing, but they don't know it's science.
No, it is science. And so that was why I was then called the quantum psychologist, because I started talking about these things as they apply to our mental health and as they apply to understanding our mental health, and also educating people about how we perceive ourselves in our 3D world. And that's not the only world we really exist in, even though it's the only world that our brain in its current form, for most people, can actually understand. But a lot of people are opening themselves up to alternative ways of thinking and having alternative experiences with it. And I think that that's a really important point to make, because, what 20 years ago we would have perceived as this person, was losing their mind if they felt that they'd had contact with, beings from other worlds or whatever. We can actually understand that there's probably some rational reasons about, what they've experienced in some level of alternate reality. It's just that most people in a three-dimensional world can't understand it, so therefore they close it down, because in the 3D world, we're very judgmental, very black or white. It's this way, it's that way. And yet, in a 5D world, there is no judgment, because it's a whole bunch of alternative experiences that different people have.
What's coming up for me is Michael Bernard's 4 level of consciousness. Is it similar to that?
I'm not familiar with his work, but I'm going to say there's so many people at the moment that are probably more awakening to alternative consciousness things, especially, or mainly since 2012, but especially since the end of 2020, that there are lots of people talking about these kinds of ideas. And I think a lot of us in that professional space, they overlap each other. So, although I'm not familiar with it, I'm going to say probably it does.
Right. Yeah, he talks about the 4 level of consciousness, like the world happens to you and then through you, for you and then through you, something like that. Yeah. Okay.
And sometimes I think we go, our 3D mind tries to explain, the fourth or fifth dimension to other people by giving more and more information. And sometimes I think we can overwhelm. There needs to be a level of what I take people back to is try actually almost to step back from your 3D world and go back into your 2D world, right? Go back into your body and what you're feeling, right? Take the outer world away, and usually that allows you to transcend from past the 3D actually more into that 5D space. So if we think about things like astral projection, what are you doing? You're coming back into your own physical body, tapping into what is essentially a 2-dimensional experience, just you. And then we kind of transcend past what the current external world kind of tells us, and we end up in a space where we can experience a whole range of other alternative ideas, because we've bypassed this kind of little the 3D world, which sort of says, no, this reality is the only reality. And of course it's not.
Yeah. For someone who's listening who may not be aware, could you briefly explain what astral projection is?
In its very simplest forms, it's, a very deep meditative state that allows you to essentially leave your body and transcend into an alternative. The easiest way to somebody who's never understood it is to probably tap into an alternative perception of yourselves and the world that you are in. And that's from a quantum sort of mechanics, a quantum sort of physics side of things. It's sort of taking yourself out of that perceptive space that you're in with everybody else around you who's in it, and just tapping into an alternative level. And, one of the ways I sort of say to people, the best way to kind of get an idea about what that might feel like is anybody who's ever sort of hyperventilated. So breathing techniques, right? If you breathe in a lot and you take in a lot of oxygen, your head actually starts to feel a bit dizzy, and you know, sometimes then you close your eyes and you feel like you're trans sort of to somewhere that doesn't feel like you're here anymore. And in that, it's that kind of feeling, the ability to kind of tap in. And this is where a lot of that energy thing that we talk about, when you make the decision that you wish to have an astral projection experience, you're placing yourself in a space where you're allowing a portal to open up, that you're open to the experience. And that's when the universal energy source will then kind of go, oh, okay, you opened the door. Let me bring it in for you, right? And it's like anything that we want to experience that's an alternative way of thinking or feeling, it's your willingness to be open to it and actually then not be scared by what the experience might feel like. And, you know, I was at a conference called the Awakening Conference, the end of August, actually, in Manchester in the UK. And one of the things around that was you had a lot of people there who had extraterrestrial experiences of a range of different sort of varieties. And you get a group of people who will be really scared about that. And then you have a lot of other people who talk about it in a really positive way. And one of the speakers, because there was a lot of speakers from Gaia who were presenting at that conference, and one of the speakers talked about the fact that when we, as humans, and we think, I want to put this down as this is our 3D dimension human experience, as humans, where we sit there and we understand, you know, whatever our sort of extraterrestrial contact might be, then the human part of us wants to say, are they friend or are they foe? Are they here to hurt us? Or are they here to harm us? Or are they here to help us? And that's a very three-dimensional perspective on it, because, you know, when we see a man down the street at the bus stop or in the supermarket, we don't look at that man and kind of go, are you here to harm me or are you here to help me? Right? We don't do it, because, you know, he looks the same to me, like you're traveling in another country. Like we discussed, I'm in Turkey. So in Turkey, maybe, you know, this hair stands out a bit, but people aren't necessarily looking at me, am I going to harm them or am I going to help them? I'm just there and I'm a bit different to them, but there's an acceptance that it's okay for me to be there. And I think that's the approach that we need to take to, you know, people who may come, or, you know, other beings that may come and visit from our alternative sort of either other planets or external sort of realms that we don't necessarily have consciousness of. We don't have to judge what they're here to do necessarily. We just accept that they exist and they're there, and, you know, as long as nobody's trying to do anything, you know, positive or negative, who cares?
Thanks for sharing. Have you had a extra projection experience yourself before? I tried, but I think I probably wasn't open enough. I wasn't ready enough.
Yeah. So yes, I have myself. I know I've had lots of different experiences. In particular, I find when I position myself in a place that's quite a spiritual kind of place, or a place where I expect that there's a lot of really, I mean, there's good energy, ley lines, that sort of thing. Recently, I was actually at the Callanish Stones in the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, and it's one of the largest remaining intact stone circles, and I was absolutely blessed. If you've ever watched Outlander, the main standing stone from Outlander is actually modelled off the standing stone at Callanish. So it was really lovely to be there. Not only was I there, but I was there, you know, the full moon rising over the centre stone, the sun rising over, because I camped there overnight, had the sunrise over the stones, had the sunset the night before, and almost nobody there. was able to really just be in that space and be in touch with the energy expression that I was sort of feeling. The next morning, I was able to greet the dawn literally sitting with my back, meditating against that big standing stone. Now, there are moments in your life that you just kind of, are grateful to be alive. That's one for me, right? And in my journey, I think over many years, I didn't realize how many of these important spiritual kind of places around the world that I'd actually been. Just because I like to travel and I'm curious about things, but I, didn't really at the time necessarily have a good understanding of their energetic significance. And as I've started to open myself up to more of that sort of learning and understanding, it really blew my mind about how much is really not coincidence, right?
Right.
And when you have these experiences and you ask the, universe or source or what, God or whatever you want to call it, because it doesn't really matter what you call it, however you call it's fine. You ask to be shown these things and you are honestly opening yourself up to them, then you open that door for that sort of energy to be shown to you. And I think that that's a really important part of all of this. We have to step back from our three-dimensional kind of too much overthinking, right? Our very, our frontal lobe is now sort of much more developed, but we almost trap ourselves in our own overthinking. And we've lost contact with our feeling, which is very definitely in our gut. And so that's where I talk a lot in my books. I talk a lot about that sort of disconnect, and that's where the meditation, yoga, these sorts of things that bring us back into our 2D world, start tapping into that feeling inside your body and trusting your intuition and trusting the feeling that you get, and, letting go of the layer of judgment that comes from the 3D world because it doesn't belong to you.
Right. Yeah. So true. I think we all get stuck in our own world of overthinking. And I think because it goes back again to our ancestors, but those days we have, tiger jumping out of the bush, but now we don't have those kind of situations. And yet we still carry these fears walking around and overthinking what could possibly go wrong. Right?
Yeah. And it is part of how our brain is hardwired. And so, I talk about this. I was a trauma specialist, and I talk a lot about, our reaction to trauma, what's very normal, but also through our human experience, we experience trauma a lot, even, just in the everyday. But the biggest issue in trauma causing a problem for us is actually the level of responsibility that we apply to ourselves. So, and that's a judgment, right? So it's an internalized judgment. It's, did I do the wrong thing in this situation? Could I have done something different? And if I could have done something different, why didn't I? Kind of idea, which will produce a level of shame. And then that's the element that will kind of constantly feed back to us and, lead us to have feelings of depression, because it's this sense of looking back at the past and feeling ashamed of the things I should have done or could have done differently. And that's a big part of where I talk about depression, anxiety, and I'm not minimizing them because they are a very real part of our existence, but they're a very real part of our 3D existence. And so a big part of I think we have to develop a level of awareness around how we operate in our 3D world, but a big part of being able to overcome a lot of the impact of our mental health in this sort of 3D life is actually to step a bit back into our 2D world, go back into our own body, our own experience, that sense of trust within ourselves about what's right for us as individuals, and then almost transcend past the 3D into that sort of, 4 or 5D world. The 4D is just that recognition of the things around you, your aura, your energy that sort of flows in and out. And then, 5D into this alternate sphere of consciousness where we can, astral project into other places and have this sort of sense of doing things differently. but, quantum physics is very difficult for our 3D brain to grasp.
So true.
Really
I like,
hard.
yeah, I like the fact that you kind of explain it in like 2D and 3D, and you said that most of our problems, like it's just in the 3D world. And 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 as you were saying that, what came up for me was Eckhart Tolle's book. He talks about the power of now. Have you read that book before? The Power of Now?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he says that if you were to just sit in the now and realize that what problems do you have, and you actually don't have any problems like right now in this space and this time. And I think most of the problem comes from all that overthinking, right?
Yeah. So that's where I talk about, and that's the way I sort of relate it to people, because when we talk about our 3D experience, our 2D experience, our 4 or 5D experience, why I talk to people in that way is hugely because it removes the sense of personal responsibility out of it, right? Very important to do that, okay? Because the only personal responsibility really steps back into the 2D world. Come back into your own body, your own experiences, what's right for you. And the majority of the problems that we have that impact our mental health sit in the 3-dimensional world. And that's really the area of judgment. And, that's the layer around our current sort of experience or existence that is the bit that we need to try and, relieve ourselves from. Now, I'm not saying for a minute that it's easy, right? It's
No,
not.
it's
Okay.
simple,
It's
but it's
well,
not easy.
no, and and even I find when we say to people it's simple, it implies that if they don't feel that they can do it, that somehow they're not very sophisticated. I don't think that's a fair way to approach it. I think it's possible, right? But
Mm.
we have to have, I want to say, the right kind of mentor and support to enable you to connect into it. And I don't just talk about these sorts of experiences as if I've perfected the art of staying out of the 3D world. I haven't. And that's why I was talking about being authentic. I've had my own issues in the sort of last 12 months. It's definitely getting better now, but sort of from mid last year.
I was
And that
about
was
to come
because,
to that. I was about to come to that to ask you if you're open to share, because you mentioned that yeah, you're sort of going through your Phoenix journey, and if you would be open to share, because I think people can gain insights from you, and they can also learn and realize that we are all human beings, but to overcome a challenge, it's where we become the Phoenix, right?
yes,
So yeah,
absolutely.
would you be open to share what happened?
Sure. In a very quick summing up, I was a psychologist in Australia, and the rules and regulations around psychology in Australia are very, very strict. And anyway, there was something that had happened that actually wasn't right or fair or true, but the system actually tried to penalise me for it anyway, even though I hadn't actually done anything wrong. So in my normal 3D reaction experience, I don't like injustice. I think that it's wrong. And so I have a tendency to fight and push back, and which is what I did against the Australian government, which that's a David and Goliath battle right there. Okay. And as part of that process, they did some things that well, even by their own laws, they weren't allowed to do. They basically, in the legal process, offered me a deal, and then when I didn't want to agree to it, but the lawyers sort of said the best thing to do, so I agreed to it, and then that was supposed to sort of stop this particular process going ahead, and it didn't. They literally manipulated me into getting me to do something, that was less. Knowing full well that that would mean that my case against them would just be thrown out of court, which is what happened. And when that happened, I just decided that this was not a system that I was willing to participate in anymore, right? Now, that was a big thing to do, right? Because here you are with a well-established profession. You know, I had a $500,000 a year business that I just walked away from because I was put in a position where I felt, and I still feel, that Australia is not a safe place for me to be anymore. That the government literally did things that were against their own rules and regulations and did it for their own personal gain against somebody who was just a really small piece of the puzzle, right? And for no reason, no real reason other than they could, really. And I think a lot of people, I've spoken to a lot of people sort of since I've left Australia who talk about their perspective from an international perspective about Australia's approach to the pandemic, not really understanding, you know, what it was like being in Australia at the time. But I sort of say to people, I don't think we realised even as Australians how much of a police state it really is when you come down to it. It's not usually enacted, so we don't usually see the impact. But sort of since the pandemic, there have been lots of things that have been brought to the fore. And, you know, there are some things that go on that are really not right, not fair. And, you know, that's ultimate bullying from an entity against an individual that seems ridiculous when, if I just sort of talk about it, you think, surely you must have done something wrong. No, I didn't. And so that was the thing where I'm like, I can no longer be authentic and true to myself and still stay in that country. I just can't. And a lot of people have sort of said, wow, you know, can't believe you just pack up and leave. And it's like, it's just, I'm not proud to call myself Australian anymore. And, you know, that's like heartbreaking to me, right? That sounds quite ridiculous to think that, but I really do feel like I've completely lost my homeland because the way that they did things is just so big brother. It was just too much. And so I just but I was sort of stuck. I could no longer do the job that I was trained to do. I was suffering in my own mental health because I felt like I'd been bullied and pushed out the door and really treated unfairly. And when you suffer from, you know, that sort of targeted approach, then, you know, you retreat. You're trying to sort of hide from the world. And I remember actually one of the videos that I put out that was earlier in the year, because I left Australia and I went to America and I stayed with a very good girlfriend who just let me stay there and lick my wounds kind of thing until I was waiting for, I'd taken income protection insurance and a few other things that I thought would cover me for this situation. And I decided to do some spiritual sort of healing for myself. And I went to Machu Picchu and I went to Peru and I did an ayahuasca journey. And I really wanted to try and sort of understand how I'd got to this point. And actually it was through my ayahuasca journey that I really started to see that real difference between that sort of three-dimensional existence that we're in, that we react to in our mental health, that we, you know, kind of feel like we exist in. And yet there's so many other planes to our consciousness that we just don't tap into. So anyway, I went back to Australia early in the year and all of the protections that I thought I had in place for myself fell through. And it's one of the funny things that I say, you know, I say to people now, what I talk about, this is my Phoenix moment the last year. Every time I would feel like, okay, that must be it. Surely it can't get any worse. I would get smacked with something else, you know. Not only did I end up closing my businesses, then all of my insurances that I felt were all good, no, they've all been denied. So I'm still fighting about those. Then, you know, I'm under financial pressure. So then my only option is to sell my house. Well, of course, then the market's dropped in Australia. There's all of these things going on and I'm feeling more and more pressure and, you know, with no opportunity to sort of pull out of it. And my 3D existence is completely being annihilated. You know, I've lost my livelihood. I've lost my home. I've lost all of these things. And it feels like all of this stuff was just like everywhere I turned, my life was on fire, right? So it's kind of like this is madness. And it was hard to get out of bed some days. And, I spent a lot of time with my daughter, both my daughters, but my eldest daughter, I sort of moved into her house and I was spending sort of more time with her just because I needed to be somewhere that felt like I was safe. And being around family feels like it's safe. That's the only place I could handle being in Australia. And then the minute that I sold the house and I'm like, that's it, I'm out of here, I'm going overseas. And I get overseas and even when I'm packing up the last bits of my house, I said to my younger daughter, it was exhausting to put your whole life into boxes and, to feel like you had nothing left. I mean, and then go, why has all of this stuff happened? Even in that last year, some of my friendships and some of the different things that had happened, they all seemed to have problems in them. It was like the universe was cutting every cord that I had tying me to Australia. And even, my daughter, when I asked her and she's like, and I said, am I doing the right thing? One moment of questioning myself. And she's like, Mum, you've spoken about this my whole life. Just go, right? Life is too short. And, as she would tell you, they're my words coming back at me, right? And, I mean, on top of all of that, my brother got terminal cancer. There was people saying to me, oh, maybe you should stay, because you don't know how long you've got with him. And it's kind of like, actually, that was all the more reason to go and live my life to the fullest because we don't know what's going to happen to us next. And all of these things, every turn where I felt like in the three-dimensional world, I'm curled up in a fetal position thinking this can't possibly get any worse. Then the next thing, something else would go wrong, even right up to the very end. And when I sold my house, at the moment that it should have been the relief of, well, at least then, I can pay everything off and I can get out of here. I had this ridiculous thing with the ACT government because somebody else had decided to cause a problem in my life and they've withheld money from the sale of the house. And you just kind of go, will it never end? Right? And another, some legal processes that should have gone my way and then didn't. And you just go, what on earth is going on here? But it really was very much this point that the universe is like, you can't stay in Australia and do what you need to do. In order for me to fulfill my purpose, I had to get out from under the cloud that was stopping me talking to you about things like this. And knowing that every time something else would come along, and I'm going to say right up until the big shift has only really been, it started to get better, but the big shift's only been since the 1st of September. And there's a whole numerological reason for that. But after that blue moon in August, like energies just started to shift for lots of people, not just me. But really interesting to me, every time I hit something that would knock me down, I always talk about music, right? Using music, I get knocked down, but I get up again, right? And, it might take me a little bit of time, but I'm still going to get back up again. The insurance companies in Australia feel like, well, you're supposed to stay home and go and see the doctor every week and take pills. And then we say you're sick, but, you don't have a mental health issue if you're traveling around the world trying to heal yourself by going to, different energy kind of situation. No, because they're judging me from this three-dimensional world. And I just kind of went, I'm just going to do what I know is right for me. And I'm going to talk to people openly about what it is that I'm doing in order to step outside the box. And this is a big part of where I feel like now that Phoenix is really starting to rise. And, my connection to source, my purpose in life, why am I here, is to actually help other people that they can transcend past thinking about their own mental health in terms of this three-dimensional experience. And, give them some guidance on how they might do that. And do it by talking to them about a whole variety of ways that we can do that. It's not just one way of doing it, which is what the three-dimensional mental health kind of experience, the clinical model says it must be this way and this way is the only way, which is that very sort of, narrow-minded, judgmental kind of way of approaching things. And I just don't agree with it. And I just could no longer live authentically and stay in it. And so, here I am waiting for somebody to question whether or not I'm allowed to call myself a quantum psychologist, because who judges who's a psychologist in the quantum realm?
Yeah.
I don't know. The Quantum Council, the Galactic Federation. I don't know who gets to determine whether or not that's what I'm allowed to call myself. It's interesting, right?
Right. What was it like for you when you had to pack everything and leave everything your whole life, and then, I guess pack your life in a box or in a suitcase and leave and starting over? Because I think many people are afraid to start over because of the fear of unknown. But I also believe that when we ask for something, really, really be careful for what you ask for, because then the universe will put you through hell and shit.
Absolutely.
But then you really burn like a phoenix and you really rise, right?
And I think that that's a big part of it, is because, for years and years, I was trying to do a whole bunch of stuff sort of to the side. But, the rules and regulations in Australia were so tight that I wasn't allowed to express a personal opinion. So it made it very difficult to be this sort of authentic and actually to talk about what is the amalgamation of my life experience and my knowledge and my awareness and that stuff that comes from three-dimensional sort of book education, but also, my ability to connect in with the divine and however that sort of channels through me at different points. And I just think that being able to step into that will help so many more people. It's probably been one of the things that I've been, trying to do for a long time, but because I felt like I was almost caged in by this framework that I just couldn't break free of, it literally felt like I was, in jail, in bind, like I wasn't allowed to do the things that I knew that I was meant to be here to do. But it takes, a lot of people talk about courage, and, courage, it's interesting because having courage in some ways is actually vibrationally, it's still a bit negative, which is interesting. But it's because you have to push yourself to do a particular thing or achieve something and drive yourself towards something in the face of a lot of adversity and against a whole lot of shame. I was trying to speak openly about my own mental health and the suffering that I was going through at a time when I was also trying to transition from being a psychologist to being, doing corporate mental health, and trying to find new clients in a new sales kind of processy world. And I wasn't functioning very well. So how was I, how could I legitimately stand up every day and do that? And the reality is that for, the first 6 months of this year, I had a new book out, and I was doing all of the sort of, like I was doing news articles and things like that. But the rest of the time I was trying to take care of myself, right? Trying to make sure that I could keep myself functioning enough to be able to pack up the house, sell the house, give up every connection that I had to a place that I've lived my whole life, where my children and my extended family are, and up and leave it. I at that time didn't know if that was going to be a permanent thing. Was it just a temporary thing? Do I just need to get away from it so I can, heal, lick my wounds and feel better about it? Or is this a permanent thing? And as it's turned out, it's actually a more permanent thing. I've just we're finalising the purchase at the moment, but I've just purchased a house in Corfu in Greece. I wanted to have a base in the EU. I know I'll do a lot of work in the UK and in the US, and that seems to be the main areas, because Australia has this very weird situation where most people who are doing good stuff end up having to go to another country where everybody thinks that they're doing good stuff and they get some sort of recognition in another country, and then Australia says, oh, you can come back now, we like you now.
Sorry,
and I'm just kind of like, oh, it's ridiculous. But it's always been a bit like that. So, Europe, having a European base gives me much greater access to places like, Dubai. I'm doing some stuff, the UK, or Europe, obviously, and then it's much easier to get to the US. Australia is a lovely place to live, but it's just so far from the rest of the world that it makes doing, international business a little bit challenging. So yeah, there'll be a few different things I think going forward, and I think I have a large group of people that I'm connected to who are all digital nomads. So that was one of the things that I was looking at to begin with. I think the ability to, make this time with you and sort of go, oh, I'll be in Turkey and I'll be in a hotel. Yep, that's all right. We just make the time and we just do it. Getting used to, I think getting used to that has been a little bit more challenging. The biggest problem that I've had with that, honestly, is getting my routine back because, I haven't been in the gym for months. My eating's all out because, I'm not necessarily, some places I'm doing my own food, but other places I'm staying with friends and, you don't feel like you have control of, your meal sort of situation and such. So there's lots of things I think that are a bit up in the air, but it helps that I am the sort of person who I actually thrive on new things and novelty. I think if if I was on the other side of the spectrum, there's no way I could do this. But, I really thrive on novelty and I like change and I embrace change. And I think from that perspective, it makes it much easier. But because I'm older, I find my body doesn't like change. That's been much more difficult than I ever anticipated it could be. Just silly things. Well, not silly, but they're basic things like, a simple good desk setup for if you're going to sit at a computer. Well, I can't do it. I mean, I was having a lot of physical issues with sitting at the computer desk all the time anyway, but I just find that in this situation, I have to space meetings out and things because I'm not in an ideal setup for myself. And my body will just pay out on me if I even try it. So it's a lot of those things, being open to having the experience and assessing this time with, does this work for me or not? I like the idea of traveling. I enjoy traveling. Could I permanently, travel out of a suitcase? I probably could do it for longer than most. But I think the idea, I know that ever since I made the decision about this house in Corfu, I actually feel more grounded. Because even though I'm not living in it, and even though it's going to take me 2 years until it's livable because it needs full restoration and whatever else, I feel like I have a place in this world, right? And that's really, I've started to realize just how important that is, that there's a place that you can actually feel like you've got some roots, even though that place is not a place that I've actually lived yet. I have met a few people there. I managed to connect with all the expats who live in the little village where I've bought this house, and we all went out for dinner. It helps probably that I'm quite social. So I will, and I'm an extrovert. I know you can't tell this looking at me. But the ability to be able to kind of put yourself out there and meet people and talk to people, and having, the openness to do that, I think has been probably one of the things that means I have been able to do it. And yeah, I know there's lots of people who have said to me, lots of my girlfriends as well, who are in a similar position, go, oh, I wish I could do that. It's like, you can.
You can. Yes, you can.
You can. You've just got to choose to.
Yeah.
You have to make that decision and follow through with it. Yeah.
So great. Thanks for sharing your journey. I think it's really important. And also the key points that you've highlighted about embracing, being open, just to possibilities, right? So that's really important, because I think many people try to they worry too much on the uncertainty that they lose the opportunity on what could possibly could happen, right? So thanks for sharing. I wanted to talk about mental health. So in your perspective, what do you think is the number one challenge most people face when it comes to mental health?
Certainly post the pandemic, it's anxiety. So anxiety, we just need to understand anxiety for a minute. And, most people probably know this, but really anxiety is just fear. And what happened during the pandemic is that from a range of reasons, because our environment was controlled around us, no matter where you lived, there were things that were imposed, obviously to keep us safe, I understand. But what it did was actually elevate everybody's vibrational kind of space, right? We all started vibrating in fear. And we know this in terms of what happens in our brain in the amygdala. And when we talk about fight, flight, freeze, right? So in the face of a fear, right, in the face of a threat, what we normally do is we assess, can we fight it, right? So, the deer sees the lion, it goes, can I fight it? No, the lion's got bigger claws and bigger teeth. And so my only option is to run. So then I flight, right? So then I'm going to do a runner. Most of the time when we end up in a situation where we end up with longer term mental health issues, it's because we cannot react in the way that we feel that we should with regards to our fight, flight, freeze, right? Because the freezing part comes when you're trapped. So if I stop and think about my own situation and what happened last year, there were times where I didn't feel like I could do anything because I just felt like I was trapped. I was trapped from, on one hand, in a financial sense, in another hand, about what I felt the perceived kind of, controls around me were, and I just felt like I was stuck. And that fight, flight, freeze is just so ingrained into our human experience in the face of any threat that when we can't do what the body expects us to be able to do, it actually sets up a trauma response in our brain. So what's happened in the post-pandemic world is that we see much more anxiety across the board, not just in, the adult population, but in children. We still don't know what it's going to mean for babies who have been born into places where everybody's wearing masks, right? Because we actually get a lot from facial expression, including the mouth, not just eyes. There's a whole bunch of stuff there that's, going to take us a few years still to work it out, right? And what we do also see is just a level of general anxiety across the board, people not feeling comfortable to be in public spaces or connecting with others, that, the sense of, some people would think it's just about, germaphobes and those sorts of things, but it's not. It's anxiety about other things, our financial position, and feeling that we don't have control over where we can go or not go. Or a lot of people will now overly control where they go or don't go. It limits our freedoms. And I think that's the biggest issue that we have in an anxious sort of society. And I talk about how does this translate into the workplace. I did a presentation this morning for an Australian government agency about Are You OK Day, because it's Are You OK Day today. And one of the things about that I said is this: when people get a sense of, I can't do that because I'm anxious, and you can't make me because I'm anxious, right? That it becomes this sort of Mexican standoff point because the job needs to be done, but this person's saying they're too anxious to be able to do it. So what tends to happen is then the manager will walk away and get frustrated with this person, but, this person's protected by this, I've got this mental health issue, but we're not actually resolving or building any way through it, right? When we have an anxiety response to something, we want to be able to acknowledge that it's an anxious response, but we want to work together for what is it that we can do today that means that tomorrow this will feel less anxious for you, right? We want to work our way through it together to make sure that we can start to recover from the impact of what happened as a result of the pandemic. And ideally, we want to do that before the next version of it hits the world, right?
Right.
Because it'll happen. It'll give us 5-7 years or so, and, there'll be a something else. It will be different, but it'll be a something else because that's the nature of viruses. That's what happens. So recognizing that, I think, and being able to I think it was good that we developed this awareness. We've got a much greater awareness around the world of mental health issues, which is fantastic. We still don't yet have that really good link to how it shows up in our physical body. And anxiety is a classic one because you feel it in your gut, because your brain and your gut form from the same part of the neural tube in utero. Like, that's why they look the same. Your gut kind of looks like your brain when you sort of pull it apart. And anxiety shows up in the gut. Most people get physical stuff. They either feel sick or they get, bowel issues, whether it's, too loose or too hard or whatever, because we kind of clench and hold a lot of stuff. So that recognition of that link between our physical mind, our psychological kind of mind, but rather than allowing us to stop, that we work out that we have to become more aware that, there's that feeling. Okay, what can I do to help myself? Who do I need to ask for some help so that tomorrow I can feel better about this? Rather than allowing it to just be no, that's it, end of game over. I'm not doing anything else. And you can't make me, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Really important.
Yeah. For yourself, what daily practices that you have for your own mental health?
So I have got back to a morning meditation routine. So waking up in the morning and actually allowing myself just that time to, sit and tap into my own sort of energies. Noticing, I try and spend time in the sun because I am very much I'm a human solar panel. If I don't get time in the sun, I really, I know my mental health struggles. It's part of the reason why I tend to chase the sun and avoid winter. I just try and be a little bit more conscious about what I'm saying as well. So when we get depressed, there's a tendency to talk a lot about the negative things that are happening, and it just, when we talk about that situation, what we tend to do is we keep our mind, and that the part of ourselves that is focused on that negative is the part that's in consciousness all the time. And so I try really, I try and catch that quite quickly. It's not meant to be perfect. If I was pretending things didn't hurt or harm, then I'd just be delusional, right? I'm just pushing stuff away and I'm not really dealing with it. So when negative things happen, these days I'll acknowledge that they're negative and that wasn't what I expected. And I'll allow myself a little bit of time to kind of, curl up in a fetal position, which, by the way, is actually your vagus nerve. That's actually this sense of I've got to protect myself. It's very natural to do that. I will allow myself to have a little bit of that, but then I'm sort of working, after a short period of time. I usually tell myself how much time I'm going to allow myself to do that for, and then I kind of set, then how am I going to bring myself out of it? And it's something that I try really consciously to do, but I've found that the more I can spend time, no matter how hard it is, how bad the world is, in that still trying to maintain my routine, the time I get up in the morning, what I sort of do with my day, and maintaining connection with others. So while I'm traveling, it's hard, right? I've got to make a conscious effort to connect in with family and friends and that sort of thing. And I've been traveling around and staying with people. So I'm staying with friends. So you get that kind of connection. But when I'm staying somewhere on my own, still just trying to make sure that I'm making that time to connect in with others so that I don't leave myself in this space where I could spiral into a very negative thinking.
Yeah, it's actually quite easy to go down that spiral if we're not aware of it. So I'm not saying that we will never go, but with the awareness, I think it's easier to catch that and just, switch our mind, our consciousness. So true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is. And I always say to people, it's not, don't beat yourself up for going there. you shouldn't beat yourself up for any of it. But when you recognize that you've gone there, beating yourself up about it doesn't help, but just makes it worse. So that the best thing that you can do at that point is actually start treating that part of you like it's the 4-year-old inside of you, right? And if it's a small child, what do? You allow them some comfort, right? Then you kind of you say to them, okay, it's all right now. Let's get up and let's get on with it, right? We don't just allow them to, wallow in it all the time. And when we can treat ourselves with the same level of compassion, then it makes it much easier to pull yourself out of that spiral.
So true. So true. What would you, for someone who's struggling with mental health, what would your advice be on, like, what are some daily practical steps that they can take to improve their mental health?
So a big part is trying to catch the negative thinking, all right? If you've got, what's your negative voice say? And so one of the biggest things that will keep people in a place where they're struggling is that the negative voice is the loudest voice in your head, right? And it seems to get the microphone every morning.
Yes. Yeah.
So what we need to do is then kind of recognize that that's what's happening and actually give that voice some distance. Now, for most people, that voice has got a basis in either of our parents, and in some cultures, it's not okay you're not supposed to criticize your parents. I get that. But we need to recognize that if you do have, whichever the critical parent is, that's usually the voice in your head telling you that you're not good enough, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, look at you, you're lazy, you're this, you're that, whatever it is, right? So what we need to start doing is recognize that voice, if it's mum or dad or, somebody else, and we just kind of have to start naming it for what it is. Yeah, good one, mum, that's not going to happen. That's not going to help me right now. Okay, so we get a distance from it, okay, and go with what you need to do that's right for you. Not because of what mum or dad might have thought, or brothers or sisters or everybody else everybody's got an opinion. But come back to that 2D experience. What does your gut tell you need for yourself? What's right for you? And for most people, when they're trying to kind of, especially if they're on an entrepreneurial journey or whatever, and they're looking to do things for themselves, but they feel like everywhere they turn, they don't quite, get where they need to go. A big part of it is that the plan that they usually make or the end goal that they're trying to achieve is often something that has been set for them either because they want to prove themselves to somebody else, right? Or it's this big goal that they feel will make them, then have some value somewhere. And when we can recognize that, it's a really useful point to be able to pull back and then kind of go, hang on, that's what I need to be for all of these other people. But who do I really need to be for me? What would make me feel like, I always ask the miracle question. When I get to the end of my life, what do I want people to remember me for?
That's a good one.
Yeah, right? Because it's a really simple, it draws you straight out into, I just want to be remembered for the person who showed up authentically and talked to people about the things that I believed in. Good. As long as I can feel like I'm on purpose then, if I feel like the contribution I'm making most days, I'm not going to do it every day, right? Because that's just seeking perfection. It's never going to be achieved. But in most days, if I can show up that way, then, I can feel like I'm doing what I'm meant to be here to do. That's what drives me. That's what makes me feel like my life has a purpose and meaning. That's what draws me out of bed every day to make this contribution, right? Without purpose, there's no opportunity to recover. So most people who end up in a space where they've had a psychological injury or something, the situation that I got into last year, I could have chose to stay in Australia just being reliant on the government and curled up in a ball and never got out of bed again. I could have legitimately done that, and there are parts of the system that would have enabled me to do that. But if I did that, then I wasn't going to be fulfilling my purpose.
Yes. Yeah.
And so by tapping into my purpose, that enabled me to then find a plan to get my way out of the situation that I was in, and get me out of the situation in which I didn't feel I was in control, and, make it feel like I was in another space where I was then able to tap into, where I believe my purpose is, and being authentic to myself. And, in that space, I can live, I can breathe, I can, feel like I can continue to, show up, and things become much more positive.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I like that idea of as just that one simple question of asking yourself, who do I want to be remembered uh, on the last day? I have written a letter to myself, like my future, my 80 years old, wrote a letter
Nice.
to my current self. So I kind of read that quite often to keep me on track on what I want to leave this world with, like one day when I'm gone. Yes.
Yeah. The other letter I would encourage you to write to yourself is the letter from your 4-year-old self to who you are today.
Right. I did the reverse one. I wrote from my current self to my 4-year-old, like to my younger self. And then
Yeah.
I use, because I'm a left-hander,
Yes.
so I write them with my left hand, my dominant hand, and then I switched hand to
Yes.
my right hand and
Yes.
writing it as my 4-year-old to my current self. And you know what I
Yes.
would tell? It was painful because, I had to struggle, right? But I think of all the things that I did, I think at the end I said, I'm proud of where you are today. So that gives me some comfort. Yeah.
Right. Because I actually do this process with clients where I kind of connect them into their inner child, that 4-year-old self within all of us, right?
Yeah.
And most of the time when you tap into them and you can connect into how your 4-year-old wanted to be in the world, right? What did your 4-year-old want to achieve? And then you introduce them to the person that you are today in this life. They're always super, super proud. Cannot believe, oh my goodness, you're doing what? Oh, and my 4-year-old loves that I've got the hair going on, and I really like, I just be myself, and I like colorful things and out there things, and I've managed to maintain this even though I'm an old lady. Like it's really good, right? And it's fantastic because what it brings with it is a whole bunch of self-love and care and joy in who you are as a person.
Yeah.
Right.
I think just accepting ourselves in all pieces, all shape, all sizes, whatever has happened, the past, the present, or the future. I think it's just the key of accepting ourselves. And when we can accept ourselves and all the scars and whatever has happened, I think that's when we're able to live a truly authentic life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, and it's the authentic life for you and what you think. It's not the authentic life for your parents or cousins or partners or anybody else, right? And, but having said that though, it's not easy.
It's not,
right?
It's not, but it's worth it. It's worth
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, worth it.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah. So my last question I wanted to ask is, what's your message to the world?
I think my message to the world is just to understand that, our mental struggles are a normal part of being human. They're the things that help us to remember that we're alive. If it was all easy all of the time, I say to people, without the sun and without the rain, you don't get rainbows, right? Nothing can grow. We have to have both the positive and the negative experiences to help us. And I think it's an important element to remember too, that when things are really tough, that we know that things do not stagnate. They do not stay the same.
Mm.
So because they don't stay the same, you want to think it different. You want to think it into existence for yourself. And you have to do that, acknowledging that there are all of these things. Don't do it pretending. I always say to people, actually buying the new house was one of the things I was talking to the builder about what needs to be done. And he's talking about a lot of the foundational issues and trying to, bring me around to the idea that it's going to cost a lot of money to fix the foundational stuff. And, I may not see any value in that. And I said to him, no, I understand the importance of building strong foundations. You know, there's an old Bible saying, right? You build the house upon the rock. You don't build it on the sand. So when you want to improve your own mental health and your own approach to the world, you want to go back to your foundations and make sure that there's nothing in there that's structurally causing you more problems, which is why I always say to people, you've got to go back to your childhood. You have to go back to the 4-year-old. You have to make the 4-year-old in you feel that you love and accept them for who they are, even if your parents didn't make you feel that way. And then from there, we can build that foundational stuff. And, you know, recognize that other people may have perceptions or ideas about who you are, but they don't really know you. Only you know you.
So true. So true. Great words. Thanks for sharing, Kerry. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed today's conversation. It was so much fun learning more about yourself, and just sharing your story and holding that space for you to share that story so that someone else will be inspired. And yeah, so thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me and for giving me that opportunity to share that information, because I think it's really very helpful when we have lots of different ways of getting this out to people, and it'll get to the right people who need to hear it.
Exactly. Where can one find you if they want to learn more about you and just want to get in touch with you? How can they find you?
So they can go to my website, which is Kerry Ann, A-double-N, so Kerry with a Y, A-double-N, Howard.com. You can get me through socials at Kerry Howard Psych, so P-S-Y-C-H. And on YouTube, I'm up there as the Pink Shrink. So at the Pink Shrink, makes it easy for people to find. They go, who's that pink woman? You know, she does the hair. Yeah.
I like that.
That's good.
Cool. So I'll also put your details down below the podcast so people could also find you. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kerry, for today's session. You take care.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this soul-enriching episode of Spatial Sarah, the podcast that brings back the beauty of meaningful conversations. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I invite you to carry the inspiration from these campfire-worthy conversations into your daily life. Embrace the power of connection, open your mind to new ideas, and continue exploring the depths of our own thoughts. Share this episode with someone you know will benefit. Follow and tag me on Instagram at @IamSarahSammy, #CampfireWorthyConvo. Until next episode, keep dreaming, keep connecting, and keep embracing the magic of meaningful conversations. Signing off, your spatial buddy, Sarah.